start off with the generic questions, which is like, tell me a little bit about how did you get to Baltimore? You from Baltimore? Like, where'd you grow up? What was that like?
Yeah, I was born in Baltimore and grew up here. Lived here until I was 18, and I lived in both in the city and the county. When I was a little kid, we lived in Radnor Winston, so right at like the intersection of York and Cold Spring. And then my parents split up, and my dad moved to Woodbury, and then my mom moved to Catonsville, and then my dad moved to Lauraville. And so kind of was always going back and forth between neighborhoods since I was a little kid, and got, you know, a feel for the area. Lived here till I was 18, and then went away to college, and then just kept moving. So I went to Connecticut, and then Louisiana, rural Louisiana, and then Beijing. I lived in China for a little while, and then I moved back to go to grad school in Wisconsin, and then I ended up in D.C. I thought it would be temporary as kind of a way to be near home, but I wasn't quite ready to move home. And that was like a decade ago.
I'm like getting to that point, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and it was a very particular choice, and I very much wanted to be closer to home.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel like I was ready to move back to Baltimore. And I was at a moment in life where I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do next. I'd been in an MFA program for creative writing, and I was working on a novel, but I wasn't. Anyway, I thought, I'll have some other adventure. And then I ended up in DC for almost 10 years because I got a really interesting job, and I liked it, but I didn't love it. I worked pretty hard at trying to kind of fall in love with the city. I'd fallen in love with other places. I felt a deeper sense of attachment to other places, Louisiana specifically, but I'd always felt this really strong attachment to Baltimore. And so I ended up finding that I was spending a lot of time in Baltimore, even though I was living in D.C. And gradually I realized, like, I just would prefer to move, to not make my life here.
Yeah.
And I was ready for something different. I'd been at my job for a long time. So the way I came back, though, was I decided I would look for a new job, a new adventure, just kind of a next chapter in life. I was living in DC. I gave a 1.5 years notice at my job. I was running an organization, and so I wanted transitional time. And I casually mentioned to the owner of the Ivy Bookshop that I was going to leave my job in a year because we had some professional relationship with them. And if you heard of anything interesting in Baltimore, I'd be interested in moving back to Baltimore if I could find the right thing. And he looked at me just on the spot and said, "You should buy the store from me." And it was crazy. I'd never thought about such a thing.
Yeah.
And in about the course of 15 minutes, I went from thinking that was the craziest idea I'd ever heard to thinking, like, oh my God, that's the life that's what I'm going to do with the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And so then, and then I had about a year to figure out how to make it happen.
Yeah.
So that is how I came home.
What was that process like of buying the store and then also the bookstore and then also running a relatively popular business for the first time?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating learning experience, I'd say. So I'd run a small organization. I'd run a national nonprofit, literary nonprofit, but with a small staff. We did a lot of programming in DC and ran awards programming and public programming. It's called the Penn Faulkner Foundation. And so I sort of knew what it was to have the responsibility for the finances and staffing of an organization. But as it turned out, the Ivy itself, the operations and its role in the community was quite different and more complex in a lot of ways. So it has absolutely been a learning curve. But the Ivy has an amazing staff and an amazing presence in the community and an amazing sense of attachment. And so I feel like I had this pretty remarkable circumstance in which, as much as there was to learn, I also was pretty secure that things would continue operating as it went along. And so it gave me the opportunity to kind of investigate it and see what's working well, what's not working well. But a lot of it's just been a crash course in like small business, city government, development. And in the end, I think the only essential thing, the only through line I can find is I really like talking to people and I really like asking for advice and like their expertise. And it's just very instinctual. Like, if I don't know about something, rather than thinking there's some codified knowledge somewhere that I should find, I just go and like ask your dad, like, have you ever done this before?
That's interesting to me, because I think usually the people that I've met who read a lot of books seem to be attached to a certain amount of codified knowledge. Yeah. That there's this fixed amount of knowledge within a vase somewhere, and that only certain people who've touched it can really can know the answers or whatever. But no, I'm the same exact way. That's the only way I've ever learned. Yeah. It's, my teachers might hate me or whatever, but I've never learned anything from a book. I've learned things from conversation about the book. I've learned things maybe having conversations with myself. Yeah. The book has opened up my mind to other perspectives and avenues, but even with the book, someone's talking. You know what I mean? Or the voice in my head as I'm reading it is talking to me, or something like that. So it's like, there isn't, in my opinion, I don't know, there isn't, to me, a sort of inherent quality in things. It's like your relationship to the thing, or like how you filter that into your own mind, or how you share that with other people. Yeah. So how was it running that organization? What was that organization like?
Penn Faulkner was fascinating, and that's why my dad asked me once jokingly when I was talking at some point, he's like, where'd you go to business school? And as context, like, I have an MFA in creative writing. I like fundamentally did not go to business school. But I was like, oh, the Penn Faulkner Foundation, because it's a nonprofit that's existed for 40 years, and it's a literary nonprofit, and was founded to give a major prize for American fiction. So it gives a prize every year to the best work of American fiction that was published. And then that grew into a second prize for short stories, and then a reading series in Washington, D.C. that used to be housed at the Folger Shakespeare Library, and then a bunch of educational programming that takes writers into schools to talk with students. And actually what you said is something I've thought a lot about, which is there's often this sense, and books can be taught this way, often are taught this way in the educational system, that a book is this static text and you get certain kinds of knowledge from it, but a book is always a created thing. A human created it, and part of the logic to me, and part of the use of a program like Writers in Schools, is for those human beings to come into the school after the student has read it for an open conversation that helps model that idea that these are someone's response to the world. This is their way of communicating deep thoughts that they have, but also that the text isn't like an inviolable kind of knowledge. Instead, it is in fact this kind of it's authentic communication. And so it's an amazing thing to sit and see young people like ask a question of a writer, and the writer to say like, I don't know the answer to that about their own text, or say, oh, I wish I'd done that differently, or I could have done this and I could have done that, and it's all kind of an experiment. And to watch students realize for the first time, or internalize or feel, oh, this is someone's creation, and that both means that I get to have an experience with it that isn't looking for the right answer, but is rather kind of, what is this inspiring in me? But also, I could create something, like to communicate in this way, to write, to express, to publish potentially, is a way of like being a member of a community, a reading community, and potentially a civic community. And I think that that's the really empowering thing that text does and books do. And then there's this repository of ideas that come from particular people's experience at particular moments in time. Yeah. And sometimes a willingness to go down the sort of research rabbit hole and try and find as much knowledge about something as exists in the world. But even then, there's always more knowledge. You know, there are always more archives you could look into. There's always a slightly different perspective on things. And the more you read, ideally, in my mind, the more what reading has done for me, is made me more humble, I think. It's like the more I read, the more I understand how much I'll never know. Yeah, exactly. Like, wow, okay. And so I think that may be connected to what you're saying, which is, well, I could read 10 books on this and there'd still be 1,000 other books I could read on it. And I love reading and I want that knowledge and I want that particular kind, but I can also go and talk to a human being who may have had something that's at least akin to or adjacent to the kind of thing that I want to do. which I think diverted from the original question of running Penn Faulkner. One of the really interesting things about running Penn Faulkner was it did all this work that I absolutely believed in, but it hadn't been the sort of operational logic and some of the financial oversight, the way that I think small nonprofits and small arts nonprofits often aren't governed with a real sense of like best institutional practices. And so part of what I really learned there also kind of in this experiential way was how you might go about responsibly structuring things financially, how you might staff in interesting ways. And for me, I think my best learning style is just in practice, to take something and pick it apart and then piece it back together. So I found it to be incredibly satisfying.
It always fascinates me whenever I talk to someone who is who has a master within whatever realm that they're in. They're rarely what I expect, and I think that's also the power of conversation. Is like breaking down. Oh well, Emma has an MFA, or this person has a PhD in whatever, or this person. And so there's this barrier for a lot of people that exist within the educational system in terms of access and these unspoken, gatekeepers, or whether that is like, if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, then you can't even come to the conversation. Because you haven't jumped through these hoops, whatever those hoops may be. And I remember, for me, because I heard you speak about the educational piece and writers going into schools, I think that's amazing, because I remember for me, I thought I was a horrible writer for my entire life. Went to public school, and then I went to private school, and then when I got to private school, whatever, I took a whole bunch of writing classes, and teachers like, oh, well, you didn't blah, blah, blah. And I didn't do X, Y, and Z, whatever that thing was. And I had no point of reference because I went to so many different public schools. There was I didn't jump through those hoops. I was never taught parts of a sentence. Like, even when I got to Park, a lot of Park doesn't really teach, like,
the mechanics.
They don't teach
necessarily
that at all. It's like a lot more free form, for sure. But even that still wasn't free enough for me. I still felt as though I didn't have whatever keys I needed to access that world. And I think I know that a lot of students that I've talked to, particularly who went to Baltimore City public schools for elementary school, often have a really bad relationship with books, with writing. And I never forget, I took my class. We formed a partnership between Park and Lockham and Bundy, which is over near the West Side Mark train station, which is right near where I grew up. And my grandmother still lives over there, family members. But yeah, it's a school, and when we went there, we visited it, and the outside looks like a prison, like for real. The windows are like the long, skinny windows. They're literally like this big. And then we went into the library, and there were no books in the library. And I remember like students, like classmates, couldn't believe it was like it was a recently painted mural, whatever, in the library. There was all these shelves, but literally
empty,
no books. And so I took that moment to try to explain to my friends, how do you expect a kid? What do you expect from a kid? What do you actually expect from a kid? Read what? Oh, you should read. Reading is fundamental. From where? From how? And there's a lot of things that I overlook, in my upbringing, in terms of my mom taking me to the library, or my aunt taking me to the library. Like, before everyone had a computer in the house, you had to go to the library card, and that's how you'd search for stuff. And so I have fond memories of going to Enoch Pratt Library. It's a beautiful library. And I haven't been there since they
renovated it.
They renovated it. I'm sure it looks
gorgeous.
It's literally like out of a movie. Like
it's like the way libraries should be.
It's almost like a museum. Like, it feels like makes you want to like pick up something, and read something.
It draws you in. It's like, well, this gorgeous place must be full of something important and valuable.
Exactly. So on the flip side, if your school
doesn't
doesn't look like that library, that you might not have that you rarely will find that one student who's self-motivated and sort of encapsulated in themselves, and it doesn't matter what their school looks like, they're going to be X, Y, and Z. And so definitely one of the things that I've had conversations with people about is how to decode, that barrier for a lot of young students, black or white, across the city who don't even know where to start. Like I try to remember, for me, I can remember that they were like, "Oh, you should find a genre that you like." And that was kind of where I started. And then I was like, "Oh, I like sci-fi, whatever." And I remember reading. I used to read a lot at a certain point in my life, but then I remember I was reading for fun, and that was really nice. And then I remember I started reading for class, and like having to do X, Y, and Z, and I hated it because usually we got a list of questions that you were supposed to look for the answers in the book. So the whole time you're reading the book and you're trying to search for what's the answer to this question in terms of what relationship does Billy have with his mom, and then you're like, okay, boom, and then you're ignoring everything around it. And I think that's the relationship a lot of students have with books, in terms of it's an ends to a mean, and not really like you're reading it just to read. Yeah. Like most people look at you crazy. Are you just reading? Right. For what? Like, got a test or nothing like that? So I'm curious as to like what ways, whether it was at the foundation or in general, like have you seen work with trying to get students to just enjoy it?
Yeah, so definitely in that work. And actually my first job after college was I taught elementary school in this in this public school in this small town in Louisiana. That similar, it's like the kids, we didn't have a librarian, and there were books on the shelves, but they were all really old. So this would have been in the early 2000s when I was down there, and the books were from the 70s, I think. Yeah. And they weren't cataloged well, but also even though they were there, because we didn't have someone to manage it, the school just kept it locked. Yeah. So there was this theoretical library at the center of the school. Yeah. The kids would walk around all the time, but we never went in it, and they didn't have access to any of the books. And the books weren't necessarily the most appealing books in the world, but still. Yeah. I mean, sort of everything about it was like, this is sending... We are not just not using this resource, but it's sending a message about what is valued here and how you should interact with books. And I think, so that experience, and then working at Penn Faulkner and running Writers in Schools are sort of, I think I had a set of observations, a lot of which very much just circle around pleasure reading, which you're referring to there. Because pleasure reading can be incredibly, and always has some intellectual value, but can have a lot of intellectual value. And specifically what it does is develop a relationship with text and with reading that then becomes comfortable and becomes like a default setting and a default mechanism. And a way of engaging, a way of both like having an interior life and developing that interior life, a way of like developing your own interests and very specific interests. Also just a way of gaining proficiency so that you can read very easily and fluently, so that you can go out and read harder texts and you can access information that otherwise is gatekept, And so there were just so many things around it. And I think one of my critiques of certain things in the American educational system in the last couple of decades is that it became very transactional. It became very means to an end based. So it was like, is this or doesn't this have relevance to like potential earning power one day for like an 8-year-old? And it's like, well, that 8-year-old is never going to be writing that memo in that office if they don't, which also is just like a hellscape of the future. But even if we think that that's the ultimate end state, which I adamantly disagree with, but they're not going to get there if they don't learn to like to read when they're 6 years old and 7 years old and 8 years old, and they're not going to learn to like to read through reading test prep materials so that they can prove proficiency in certain sort of transactional educational skills that you've identified on a spreadsheet. They're going to learn to be fluent readers who care about reading by reading the picture books about the thing they're interested in. Are they interested in frogs right now? Let them pick a book about a frog and feel that sense of autonomy and agency in that selection process. And that is actually going to build all of these kind of holistic literacy skills around attachment to books and relationships with books that not everyone gets in their home, because not all homes are full of books, and not everyone has walkable from their house to the library, because not all houses are walkable to libraries, and because some, and it's there was I think a misinterpretation of sort of not enough attentiveness for a long time to how people weren't learning in schools, and it became very, very, very kind of regimented and transactional, and it's in our interpretation of what education is, and it just gutted like the emotional value. But at the end of the day, like, human beings are motivated it's all about human motivation. Like, how do we motivate people to want to be active, lifelong learners? How do we motivate people to want to be good citizens? How do we motivate people to want to care about other people? And when everything is sort of flattened down to sort of a utilitarian end state of earning potential, that you're looking at it like elementary schoolers and talking about it that way, it's like, well, we have really like already become a dystopia. And,
that's real.
It's real.
It's real. No, it's real.
Yeah.
It's crazy because it can really brainwash you. Once you sign yourself. So I'm a musician. Like, that's if somebody asks me, who are you? I'm a musician, and I'd say I'm an entrepreneur. And so because of that, there are always, and there will always be moments in your life, at least for me in my life, in which I have to decide how much I'm willing to sacrifice of my creative, of my freedom to get to do the transaction. And I think that, in my opinion, what I saw and what I learned by working at an arts organization that was in schools doing OST, out of school programming, was that everything was connected to a budget. Everything was connected to a bottom line. And so there's this weird thing that's happening where people know that the problem is that there is, that students aren't learning. Students aren't really, it's not seeping into them. For some way, somehow, it's not working. And everybody thinks that it's these end goals, these results that, okay, well, social emotional learning, or whatever this new term is, whatever they are, they want to hit these different marks. People think that's the answer, where the answer is like on a student level. Like, literally no one is talking to the students and saying, hey, what is it about school that you don't like? Why don't you think that? Which sounds like, I mean, it's very Park of me. But like, the answer isn't in the bubbles that they're circling. It's not like, okay, well, we've seen that actually these bubbles are less filled and blah, 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 blah. And so now we can look deeply into the mind of these students or into their lives. You have no idea. And I just see it, like you're saying, it's a dystopia in the sense of like, it's getting worse and worse, and schools are just churning out, I mean, I don't want to get too conspiracy theories, but there is value. There's value for the economy in people not being educated. Because you don't want everyone to think that they can do everything. You want a bulk of the people.
Well, right. And if we have a system that's predicated upon sort of large corporations that are going to break jobs down into less sort of into very structured, kind of generic,
low skill
units,
like
very regimented.
Operations, like,
then that's a different kind of preparatory process. And I think that it's funny. It's like, it's not a conspiracy theory, but it's that the system starts to govern itself. Like, the logic of the system then governs the logic of the people who are running the system, and therefore it heads down. And there are a couple of really interesting books. There's a book called Bullshit Jobs by this sociologist, David Graeber.
I listened to his podcast or interview on NPR or something like that. I listened to it.
No, and it is hard to read that. He wrote it because he had an essay that went viral a couple of years ago that was sort of describing these and just it went viral, and people had these passionate outpouring responses saying, like, I have one of those jobs. Like, 40, 50 hours of my life every week is going into something that I know is completely meaningless, just like maintaining a system whose only meaning is in perpetuating the system. And like, oh my God, I feel horrible. Like, I hate my, and it's that sense of, but that's how I pay my bills, and that's how I then have another life my life at home that allows me to like get through the day. And it's like, well, this is just not it isn't a smart way. It only takes a few steps back to look at it and say there's something very wrong with a set of conventions that argue that this is how we want to make use of the human beings who live in this world. And it's totally tied into environmental degradation. And it all is this, it's sort of a system we've created that is killing us. And I think in that sense, in terms of the educational system, a lot of it boils down exactly. It's like, well, who's just talking to someone and saying, what motivates you? What are you interested in? Why do you come to school? And one of the interesting things about arts-based programming is when arts-based programming, the more it's looked at itself and said, why does this matter? Because that's a really important question. And frankly, some programs don't really matter. And that's fine too. And we shouldn't. So it's not that there shouldn't be an assessment process, but when you really start asking that question, a lot of it's that. It's like, I come to school for the theater. Like I sort of get through the school day and I go to school because I want to be in the play, or I want to be in band, or I want to be in a writing club or something like that. And so it's like, okay, first of all, I would argue there's educational, intellectual, cognitive content in that experience, even if it's harder to quantify. But also, if that's the motivating factor for going to school and doing well in math class, even if you don't have a natural affinity for math, then that has extraordinary value. And if it just has that value of creating a sense of positive culture at a place, because I think every human has experienced sort of bouts of depression or bouts of sort of just malaise, like lack of motivation that makes everything harder. And it's like, if you love something, if during the course of the day you get to do something you love at some point, then you can kind of do anything, you can endure anything else. But if you don't have that, then you just phone it in everywhere because it's a bullshit job circumstance. Because it's like, I gotta like.
Yeah, there's all these weird attachments that we have to maintaining a sense of like homeostasis, like as individuals, as communities, and then like as a society, which in my mind leads to, we just aren't, it's weird. So it's like capitalism in my mind, and this is kind of what we're talking about in terms of how capitalism, the effects it has on education. What it does is it creates an image of what you should be, or what someone in that system, what the greatest of people of that system look like, talk like, smell like, feel like, whatever. And so you spend all your life, or your 20 years or 21 or 18, however long, until you realize that you just don't want to do it, trying to fit in whatever that mold is. And then what they don't tell you is that in order to actually get to that mold, you need a whole bunch of things that you might not even have by nature of your birth. By nature of you just not being born into a wealthy family that can afford you to have the tutors to excel you, so that you make it to that level. So you really can't get there, period, if you try to do it through that recipe. Like you can achieve happiness, you can achieve wealth, or whatever it is you want, but a lot of times it's rarely through those systems. It's rarely like someone going off to the side, doing their own thing, studying something that no one else might not care about, and then figuring out how to make it relatable to other people, and then making that a product or branding that or whatever the case may be. I was listening to an interview with somebody, some billionaire person, who like mentors other billionaires, and I was just on the YouTube rabbit hole, and he was like, no one's ever, I don't know how true this is, but he said no one's ever made $1 million from working at a job, but that's not what they tell you in school. They tell you in school that, hey, you go to college, you get yourself a good job, you can't become a millionaire one day, you can't. And it's like, if people figure out, well, what are you chasing? Are you chasing $1 million? If you really are, you should not be working at a job. Most people won't make $1 million in their lifetime. Which is fine. If that's what you're chasing, if that's what people are selling, that's not a reality.
And it's, I think the sense, I think also just giving people a sense of autonomy. And sometimes a lot of this stuff can also seem like, well, sure, if you have the resources, and it's like, or if you don't. I mean, or if it's equally important for everyone to feel that they have, that their life reflects their exterior life reflects their interior life in some way.
On some level.
On some level, and that they have some agency over choices that they're making. And also that I think, I'm actually going to a career day at my high school tomorrow morning. I just remembered as I was coming down here. And so it's interesting to think about that and about, in terms of this conversation, like what I'll say there about kind of how I ended up where I am. And part of it is, at each moment in time, if you feel like you're making a decent choice and doing something that is motivating and interesting in that moment in time, I think that's a decent way to live a life. And there's no guarantee of precisely what the end state will be, but what you're likely not to do is look back and say, well, I wasted years of my life chasing something that I couldn't achieve or didn't achieve. But also, you'll discover along the way, like if that's sort of an essential pressure point at each moment, you'll discover authentically what you like. And that thing may be wildly different than the thing you thought you wanted to do. What motivates you, what you find actually creative and engaging can change over time. And that I think we receive a lot of messages about kind of what you said earlier on about there's a gatekeeping and a kind of definition around what constitutes a creative life, what constitutes a life of value, what constitutes a life, what constitutes wealth. You know, and it's like there's money and there's also joy and there's also just like engagement and there's experience families, and there's service and there's people, like human connection and there are all of these things. And you certainly have to have a certain level of financial stability in order to access a lot of those other things, because it's sort of horribly stressful and it confines a lot of other choices. But it's also, I think, you know, to be able to think more holistically. And I think that one of the really, 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 really fundamental problems with capitalism, in my view at this point, is that it sends this message that is utterly distorting the world, that accumulation of wealth is this ideal end state. And it's just hard to imagine. I mean, first of all, after a certain point, you just can't spend money. It's we've created like a value scheme that means you're seeking a kind of like emotional benefit, but it's actually like destroying other systems and structures and people's lives in the pursuit of that. And it can't really be used for the function it has. Every dollar that a billionaire makes has no value to that billionaire,
Zero.
but would have a lot of value to a lot of other people. And so the distortion
destroys other things, like
it destroys things. And it's like, so if we don't, when this argument about taxation, sort of aggressive taxation, and it diminishes people's motivation, I'm sorry, but if you're not adequately motivated by like making $200 million and you need that potential, then like maybe it's okay if you stop doing the thing. You know, it's that sense of where does our culture and our society, how do we collectively define health in cultural terms, in societal terms, in emotional terms, in environmental terms, and all of those things. And that's where capital markets just don't do any of that. They don't define any of it.
I was going to say, there is no goal. That's the thing. Like, there's no goal state. The goal state is have a bunch of money, and the money will allow you to figure
out the other things. And you never get to the point where you stop, because there is no moment when someone feels like it's enough.
There is no person that is of that wealth that I've met. I've met some wealthy people that go to me, you know what? I'm amazing because of all this money that I have.
Right.
Most of the times, those people are literally dealing with the exact same problems. Other people, and it sounds like a cliche, like, they have the same problems, but like, money does not solve your family relationships.
Right.
Money, it if anything, it prolongs. It's like, and then this once again, like, not to go too left, but but I think I literally see the exact same pattern in every system within the American system in terms of like health and medicine. It's like we're not actually trying to solve anything. We're just trying to prolong it and then just make whatever money we can make off of it in the meantime.
Yeah.
And if you look at literally every single, look at the roads in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Right? Every single, from the smallest detail, educational system. We're not actually trying to fix it. we're trying to put band-aids on it for as long as we can, as long as it's manageable.
Yeah.
Right? And to keep this sort of false sense, you make you feel like you're actually doing something, right? And then you have this weird sense of completion when you actually haven't solved anything. You've covered it up.
Yeah.
And I literally, as I drive through Baltimore, I look at the streets and I literally say that these streets are an exact representation of Baltimore. Like, there's nothing, if you want to know what Baltimore is culturally, financially, socially, politically, just literally look at the streets.
Yeah.
And it's like,
sad.
It's sad, but like literally, that's how the city deals with everything. Yeah. Everything is dealt with from the lens of, you have and this is not in particular about any companies, so no shade to construction workers, but you have the construction workers who are there usually solely to patch things up. Mm-hmm. They're not there to fix anything. They put a little asphalt on top of it, and those people could represent, some healthcare providers, bankers, or whatever. And then you have the actual problem that's being addressed, and then you have the people that make money off of those contracts. They make insane amounts of money, and they're encouraged to actually draw it out longer, because the longer the project, a lot of times they make more money.
Right.
So there is no reward for solving a problem, really solving it efficiently, and making sure that the problem doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. So if you start off knowing that in our society, then you shouldn't. I have conversations with friends who are a lot more idealistic than I am, and it frustrates them. They go, why isn't the society like this, and why aren't we like this, and why don't we just help people? I was like, what are the benefits? Mm-hmm. Like, if people's only benefit is money and how to shave a piece of wealth or shave a piece of whatever off of what the process that's happening, then there is no motivation to solve it. Because once you solve it, it's like those people with the bullshit jobs. If I actually did my job, I'd be out of a job.
No, that's one of the absurd things about it. It's like, if I articulate too effectively how useless this is, then I can't pay my rent, and I can't get food for my kids. And so we've created a cycle. And part of it is, if you look back at, like John Maynard Keynes, an economist who's writing at the early part of the 20th century, it's like the idea of mechanization, the idea of industrialization, and God knows, like the digital world, ideally would be that we would work less, that there would be more leisure time, that we thought that there might be this crisis of leisure. And instead we have this world where it's just everybody, again, it's bifurcated. It's like you either work 50 or 60 hours a week, or there's large-scale unemployment, and the system just isn't getting us to a steady state that's healthy, that has everybody engaged, and has an adequate amount of money, and still has innovation and interesting creative things going on, but doesn't perpetuate this sort of to me, so much of it just seems like it is about definitions of what is or is not deemed professional, what is or is not deemed to be of value in society, and it's a lot of it is gatekeeping around the kinds of roles that people do or don't play, and that a better end state is to say sort of anything that helps the community function has significant value, and therefore should be accorded sort of there should be financial value accorded to that, but also in an ideal end state, we don't have people working 80 hours a week and people who can't work. We've got everybody working 40 hours or 25 hours a week, and that's a reasonable, better, humane existence. And I think part of it goes back to the conversation about education and about books and about what I think of as culture, which is if you teach people or if people are encouraged to think deeply about the experiences, and that's where sort of true emotional health or psychological health, and that being prioritized early, you create patterns and habits that can allow for the kind of reflection that also happens when you read a lot, when you think, when you talk about books a lot, when you talk to other people about what are the challenges we're going through, that you can better recognize there's something amiss. There's something that is dissatisfying to a lot of people about the society, about the structures that run our world that we've created. And how do we go about not just saying we wish it were different, but saying, okay, so let's assess that this is what it is, and how do we go about fixing it? And I, for me as a small business owner, the thing that I have felt most energized by and that I have felt to be most promising in a world that sometimes seems quite dispiriting and sad these days is the idea of local community and is the idea of like local business, local places. I mean, I'm utterly biased, but places like Bird in Hand that bring people together and where just human interaction is the currency, right? That there's that sense of relationship-based life, a life where people then are talking and valuing and advocating on behalf of using local spaces, getting to know your neighbors, like living within community again. Because, you know, if there's I guess for me, if there's just a broad observation, it's that for the latter half of the 20th century, we thought that scale and efficiency were going to solve all of our problems. And it turns out scale and efficiency are not a human way to experience the world. Yeah. Right. Like, so we've created a wildly alienating structure for ourselves, and we all feel alienated by it because the thing it deprioritizes is human interaction. Yeah. And digital life promises that endlessly. And people are starting to, at least instinctually, rebel against that, I think, and revert to physical experience and kind of community. And I think a next stage, and this is so true in Baltimore, is so how do you make that accessible? How do you make those observations accessible to everyone? How do you make that not the province of the wealthy? Because that is an inevitable, so now the thing that is gatekept is like getting to be a human.
And that's as crazy as some people might think that is, that's real in all parts of the world, because people buying clean air in California, like, so what does that say for people who can't afford clean air? Like, what? Like, it's interesting, and it is something because I go to Bird a lot, obviously. There 4 to 5 days out of the week, and it is something that I think is a challenge because you want to find a balance. It's like having a garden. Right, you want the ecosystem to have a balance. Like, you need differences of opinion, you need differences of experiences, you need diversity of thought for it to be something that can grow. Yeah. You don't want to have 20 Zekes in the same room or 20 Emmas in the same room or whatever. Like, that sounds horrible. Yeah. Right? Duh. And so a lot of the times, like you've mentioned, what you will have is you will have these spaces that are for the community, that are for promoting real, authentic conversation, that by not by the virtue of those spaces, but by the virtue of the society, will get hijacked by a certain socioeconomic or cultural slice of a subset of the overarching community, and they will co-opt that space and say, well, and then no one's saying, hey, this is our space. But by virtue of the numbers, it will look like that space. Yeah. And then, and we're back to the gatekeeping issue in terms of, and then you wonder and you try to figure out, okay, well, how do I promote other people, right? The others that don't fall into the demographic of, you know, like having a business, like how do you diversify your customer base and not, it's just all the same people. Because I think that is really what it ends up becoming, and that creates all types of problems. And I think that's true regardless of the space that you're in. You know, in Baltimore particularly, things are so stratified by race and by neighborhood and by whatever. But that's true of any neighborhood. That's true of a neighborhood in Ruxton or in Roland Park or in Greenmount or in Midtown Emerson. Yeah. When you don't have diversity of thought, we don't have a diversity of experience, then people can't solve a plethora of different problems. Yeah. Everybody's trying to solve the problem with the same way. And it's just like,
and right. No, I think that's really well said. And I think that is one of those questions of sort of how do you maintain spaces and signal that those spaces are open to true variety, which sometimes means something that you're not totally comfortable with, and that's part of being a member of a community. That's part of being a citizen in a society. Exactly. That will be healthy and that we will ideally live in. And I think it was one of the interesting things about living in a really small town in my early 20s. I think because it was a town of less than 2,000 people. We didn't have a stoplight, so we had one of everything. Right? There was like a grocery store. There was a pharmacy. There was a there wasn't variety. Yeah. And so everybody uses the same place because there's no other option. And I mean, this is not to romanticize small town South. Is real.
I was like, I went to college.
Real fucked up.
I was going to say, there's a different set of problems.
It's a different. It is problematic, but it is one of the interesting observations was what happens. Proximity matters, and that's, again, I think it probably informs some of what I sort of see in terms of sort of self-segmentation that then happens in other places or ways, or people who will say like, oh, I wish the world had, like, how can people be against diversity? And it's like, well, what neighborhood do you live in? Who are all of your neighbors? Like, how much daily experiential diversity do you have in socioeconomic terms, in terms of political affiliation, in terms of just the kind of work that people do in your daily life? And
it's almost, sorry.
Oh, no, go for it.
I was like, it's almost like people need to go on like an exodus that is the opposite of everything that they grew up with.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, because I only say that because I had to, because I went to school in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky, and Berea is.
Oh,
I mean, it's the college.
Berea is an amazing institution.
Yeah. So I went to Berea, and
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I went to Berea, and Rachel's parents also both teach at Berea. Wow. Yeah, so that's how I met her. They've been professors there for 30 years each. Or something like that.
It's
like a magical
place. It's
like
a
and it really like. I mean, it has its own sort of problems, but it really, really is. Like, it's not just the articles or whoever's saying it. You go there, and it's a conscious choice by whoever decided way back, John G. Fee, way back in the day, to do certain things to promote just humanity. Like, it really is, because, like, there's so many things I didn't want to do, right? So, like, at Berea, when you come there as a freshman, you're given a job.
Right.
I worked in food service, and all my best friends are my friends that I work with.
That you worked with
at food service.
Yeah.
Like, we wash dishes together, we clean. I mean, it was like, and it's for real. It's not like there was no other staff that was helping us wash dishes. It was like we had a job to do, we got trained, and we did it. And we did that 10 to 15. Some people did 30 hours a week, whatever you can manage. And what that does is it gets you comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I think that is similar, like what we're talking about is people have this sense of complacency and just like they have to go into spaces where they're comfortable. And I'm like the complete opposite. Like, and it's like definitely something I've noticed. So I'll tell you a funny story and then I'll relate it to Bird. So when I was in high school, we had a really super nice library at Park, and the librarian, Susan, she was amazing. And I'm naturally a really loud person. And I didn't really understand the dynamics of a library because it just wasn't, I'm like the opposite of a library. And so like I would be like laughing really, really loudly in the library. And Susan used to have to ask me to leave the library sometimes. Long story short, me and Susan are like this now. And what I think she learned, or at least what she told me that she learned from me being in a library and me not just me being the odd one out, is that there has to be some type of room for people who don't instantly get it.
Yeah.
For people who don't instantly assimilate into the room and go, oh, well, everyone else is doing this thing, so I'm going to automatically do this thing. And if I'm not doing this thing, then people look at me like, if I don't have a MacBook out and I'm not typing and doing whatever it is that people do, it's okay.
Yeah.
I can do other things. And I think back to this sort of idea of gatekeepers and barriers to entry for people, those are the types of things that keep people out, that no one's saying, hey, you can't come here.
Right.
But what is sort of implicitly being said is everyone who comes here at least has whatever. And if you don't, it may be difficult for you to fully enjoy, or this might not be the place for you.
Right.
And so back to me going to Berea, I was forced into all types of situations that it's out of my depth, and I had no choice. And so I went to school. So it was like, figure out how to be. And what I learned that experience literally outside of the classroom is one of the greatest, if not the greatest experience of my life, because I was forced to befriend people literally from different parts of the world. Like I had a roommate my sophomore year who's from Afghanistan, Mortaza, and he told me stories. Like we would like exchange stories at night, and he told me stories about him having to literally hand ammunition to his dad to fight Al Qaeda and all these different terrorist groups that were actually attacking their village. And his father and a whole bunch of other people were part of a resistance. And so what that does is you learn so much about a real account of what you've seen on TV, and you're not just going, oh well, if you look like this, you wear a turban, you have a thick Middle Eastern accent or whatever, then that automatically means that you agree and you blah 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 blah. That blew my mind because my only association with that was the news. And conversation about it was so polarized. There was no like real account of, well, yeah, there were some good things and there were some bad things and there were some issues and there was a reason why people didn't want foreign, and there was like the whole dialogue didn't exist. And if it did, it existed in outlets that were not easily accessible to the everyday person like me. Whether that is, and as amazing as NPR is, and I do love NPR.
Me too,
there is this like, it is a kind of status symbol. That if you got NPR going in the car on your way to work or whatever, if you didn't grow up with that, if your parents didn't listen to NPR in the car, and you somehow didn't stumble on it, then you might not ever listen to it. You might get your news from Fox or MSNBC or ABC or whatever the thing is. So it's like, but if all that good information is there, how do you disperse it? How do you filter it? And that's like something I'm really interested in. And I think I always have been, is figuring out how to disperse really important information from the people that I might know to the people who might need it the most. Because there seems to be a disconnect. You know?
No, there does. I think in that sense of how do we disperse the information and how do we invite people into experiences that they would get a lot out of or they'd enjoy, but that aren't signaling that it's for them. And I think that it does happen in so many implicit ways, in physical spaces, but also definitely in media and sort of content. And in a world where there's just an infinite number of choices to make all the time, we get exhausted, and so we default into the things that are most comfortable and most. I think about that principle all the time in terms of Netflix. Like, I used to be really thoughtful about what I watched, like movies and TV, because I had to make choices within a universe of choices that was reasonable to make. Like, I'd go to the video store and I'd physically browse, or I'd surf through 5 channels and I'd find something to watch. And if there was nothing interesting, I wouldn't watch something. And with Netflix, it's like it just serves up something that's just okay, comfortable. It's comfort. The word comfort you used earlier. It's comfortable. And so it's like I just lost taste. You know, it's that my taste is what I am told on there. And there are other areas of my life where I've retained it. And so I think it's even starker. And now it's really like, and part of the problem is that the range of choices got too vast. The level of effort it takes to sift through, I just can't summon the energy. So I just take what's presented to me.
And what they do is, they, meaning Netflix, or whoever it is super smart. What you do is, and I'm sure this is some like concept in like psychology, is if you overload someone, like you said, they just default to the easiest thing. And then the thing is, there's no cost of doing it. See, like, as you're talking, I'm just thinking, like, it is so detrimental to society for experiences to be so easily duplicated. Like,
absolutely, because one of the things that I think about a lot is it's like there's it's that we've elevated lack of effort.
Yeah.
But in fact, effort is how you create experience and meaning. And it's what you're describing in terms of Berea. It's like that's what develops intense relationships. Like that's what discomfort and effort and challenge is how we build a sense of self and we build strength. And also we bond to other people. And so if what we prioritize is comfort and lack of effort, then we end up with a circumstance in which we don't feel as connected, we don't feel as individually strong, we don't feel as that we have as defined a sense of self. And so then you like fill in with more of the like sort of effort-free comfort and we've elevated that sense. And then anything that stands in opposition to that like takes effort is then deemed less than. And so you just perpetuate the issue. And there's actually, I mean, it's really like, oh God, so true, but then we say like, we feel that, you know, and now there are these studies that go out and it's like, we're getting progressively more anxious and more depressed. And it's like, but you actually you can confront things like that with challenging, with the things that again, build a sense of self and build a sense of bonds with other people. And a lot of times that is like, again, putting a lot of effort into something really challenging, and the end state may be success and it may be failure. And that's okay because that's human experience.
Literally, like it is. I mean, it's literally like my mom's a teacher, and it's like, you know, I'm sure my mom said with me, I'm sure parents say this a lot. With me, she literally never let me fall. She never let me get hurt. She never let me whatever when I was a kid. And the first time I fell, I split my head open, which is why I have this scar. Oh, yeah. And she was like, oh my God, like, you know. But with my sister, it was just, she didn't throw her off the building or something like that, but she had already experienced a lot of her fears. She had already faced some of her fears of being a parent, and I had survived through it. So it was like, okay, it's not the worst thing in the world if my little sister hurts herself or if her leg hurts, or whatever it is. And we live in this world where, as old school as I might sound, where people are afraid of pain. People are afraid of disappointment. People are afraid of whatever. And I see it all the time in friends or acquaintances that I know who are, some of them are super anxious, social anxiety, different levels of depression. And I think a certain level of that, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that people don't get exposed to enough variation of experiences. If you've been going through your life this whole time and then you get shell-shocked one day and you've never had anything that resembled what just happened to you, you're going to freak out. And you're going to say, I would never want to experience that. And if you're experiencing that later in life, then you don't build up any quote-unquote like social antibodies to be able to deal with that. You know, so it's like people, I see it all the time with people who I know who, rich, poor, black, white, whatever, some of those people who don't have those like defining experiences at a young age tend to just not be able to deal with a lot. And I think we're now in a part of society where people are catering to those people and being like, hey, you don't gotta leave the house. Yeah. You don't have to go up the street to get a pizza. Yeah. We'll bring it to you. We'll do whatever it is you need us to do.
And that's where it's like
creepy.
And right. No, and it's like that's what we've there are moments when it does feel like, well, that's what we've decided to prioritize, and that's what, again, business is now. It's like, we'll deliver those cookies to you at 2 a.m. in your pajamas in your living room. Like, I would have dreamed of that when I was a teenager, but I'm not saying I like learned any great lessons from having to like run to the grocery store, but you know, or like make the cookies myself. But it's just it's illustrative of the more important thing, which is, again, if ease and efficiency and comfort are the only things, are the things that we are telling ourselves are the ideal end state, you look at a lot of experiences, you look at literature, you look at philosophy, and it's like, well, actually, I don't know that that's true. Like engagement and deep experience that is varied and like adventure and experiences, challenge and experiences with a variety of people. This is what builds sort of a life, an authentic life well lived. And if we're instructing people for extended periods of time, like the ideal end state is this other thing, then it's very hard when you hit those first challenges, both in just a practical way, but also in a what it feels threatening as opposed to feeling empowering. But it can just as easily feel empowering. It has to do with the messages we send about it. It has to do with how we contextualize it. And I think that, you know, we end up with these rising rates of depression and anxiety, and just a problem, issues around how we create meaning and how we define how people live healthy, meaningful lives, you know, and
it's as you're talking, I'm just thinking, because it's like, for me, I remember when I was younger, I wanted to be like, you know, Michael Jackson, or like, you know, the biggest musician, whoever that is for someone, might be Beyonce or whatever. And I had not seen this Beyonce documentary, but what I had listened to a podcast that it sort of broke down a lot about it. And I probably want to watch it, but it just talks about her work ethic. There's like, people can't imagine how much work she puts into this one show, and in a lot of people's minds now, especially people who are younger than me, because, and I'm just using music as an example, it is so easy to make music nowadays that sounds like what we would have seen 20 years ago. It's the same thing with the cell phone, where someone was like, you know, your camera and your cell phone is better than whatever
any camera I'd ever seen a photograph
ever.
Of.
Like,
ever.
and it's like, doesn't even look real. So then that completely diminishes, and you think, oh, well, I could do that. Oh, there's no value in me learning how to do that. There's no value in me taking a photography class, because I can just go like this. I don't have to do all that. I don't have to be in a dark room or whatever the thing is, right? And so, like you're saying, you create this sort of like, there's no motivation at all for people. And I think humans naturally need to be driven towards something. And I think that advertising agencies are very well aware of that. And like, I definitely thought I wanted to get into marketing, and who knows, maybe that'll happen at some point. But what they do know is that they know that, like, I remember when I learned the first day of marketing class, that you cannot create an emotion in a person. You can only replace what they want. So it's like, I can't tell you to eat or to not eat, but I can tell you what to eat. I can't tell you that you will never tell you to not buy soap. I can tell you what kind of soap you want to buy. And I can convince you that if you buy this thing, you will feel a certain way.
It will activate something.
It will activate something. I mean, there's an interesting, I listened to this book called The Power of Habit. And it's a really cool story. I hope I'll remember it exactly. But I think it's about the guy who figured out how to get people to buy toothpaste. Because in America, and he went on to like get people to buy a whole bunch of other stuff other than toothpaste. And basically, I read this like a year ago. In America, toothpaste wasn't a popular thing. Like dental hygiene, this is back in like, I want to say the 20s or the 30s or something like that. No one really cared. And he got a job at this ad agency, and he was like the it guy. He was younger, and his whole thing was to figure out, how do we get people to buy toothpaste and like care about their dental hygiene or whatever it is, and make a bunch of money off of it. And what he found was, he had two different toothpastes, the exact same one. One was normal toothpaste, nothing happened. And the second, there was this activation of bubbles and this sensation that you got. And people said that they felt that their mouth was cleaner. But it was not. It has nothing to do with the actual results, but the feeling that you got when you did it. It was like, oh, I feel somewhere in you feel like something, you feel different than you were before. And that's seemingly how we mark things as humans, in terms of like, this is an experience that I had because I came out on the other end slightly different, whether that was like tingling in your mouth or whatever that is. That's like seemingly how we decide, okay, this really happened. Because if I don't feel like it happened, if nothing changed, then you're looking around like, oh, I didn't really do anything.
No, and it's like the philosophical, I guess, concept of like the split between a signifier and signified, you know, that there's like the thing that is signified to have happened, and then there's the actual thing it signifies. And that we live in this universe where those two things, all we care about is the signifier. And that the substantive thing has sort of been devalued and been lost in a large part. And that's what marketing sort of that's like the defining characteristic of marketing, and we live in an age of mass marketing and mass media and saturation, and the two things are completely split, and they absolutely know, and they mine that, and they do incredible analysis, psychological analysis, and it's like a fascinating intellectual puzzle, and it's really kind of screwing things up, you know, and then you look at it in terms of political implication, and then the incredible sort of societal implications of political implication, but so much of it is around what's your affinity group? What do you feel? How do you feel about what does a certain kind of behavior signal about the kind of person you want to feel that you are, as opposed to what impact does an action actually have? And those two things, it's like we've like split them.
And it's literally it's not to cut you off, but it is what you're saying. I get triggered by it. It's why I like deleting my Facebook, and I'm slowly weaning myself off of Instagram. Yeah. To just reimagine a world in which people actually do things and don't talk about it. It's just like,
if you look at it from a distance, like sometimes you look at things and it's like the degree to which you're putting up a photo and then saying how great you feel probably indicates that maybe the opposite is true, you know? Like it's certainly it's 50-50, but also what's the impulse inside you that is leading you to want to project that image? Because if you fundamentally were feeling that way, you might be disinterested in projecting that image. And some of that has to do with personality, but there's a cultivation of image that is supplanting actual like life experience, which then gets into what you were describing of then an inability to deal when the inevitable happens, which is significant challenges arrive in life that can't be managed in terms of image, that can't be managed in terms of how you project things, that aren't about brand and they aren't about status, they're about an actual human experience. And whether or not both, you have the emotional capacity to deal with it, but then also you have the sort of emotional flexibility and adaptability to manage whatever comes after. Yeah. And that is a very close friend of mine runs a grief counseling organization that she founded, and a lot of it is sort of web accessible materials and how to create communities. But in part of it, it's there's this sense of the grief is like a discrete experience, and you should be able to get over it. And one of the basic observations is no. There are massive there are real varieties of grief that can be about the death of a loved one, but that can also be about other kinds of the death of a relationship, the death of all sorts of other kinds of experiences of loss, but also that it's something that will never leave you. Once you have a strong attachment to something or something or someone, and that thing is ruptured, you will live as a changed person forever, and denying that and thinking that there needs to be a moment at which it's been managed and you move on isn't helpful to people, because it sort of prioritizes an image of how things should be over the actual experience of how they are. And how do we create the kind of sort of resilience and emotional strength that allows us to live in the world in these sort of compromised, or not compromised, but with like the inevitable variety of experience that we have, and that there's a lot of messaging that tells us life should be lived in this more kind of discrete way or managed way, and that it doesn't seem to make people healthier.
And on top of that, just like we're having this conversation, if you've never had experience like that, right, in your life, then you can't help somebody else. You can't even have a conversation with somebody else. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense of like, there's a bunch of people who've never been through anything that are in the world now and are encouraged to maintain a certain sense of perfection or relative perfection. And so you're afraid to signal to somebody else, hey, I'm not perfect.
That you're not. No, when it's like, oh my God, if you're anything like me, you're like wildly imperfect. Like we're all just these fallible, imperfect creatures all the time, infinitely, like every day. But also part of it is, it's interesting of what you said. I read a really interesting essay recently that was about, I think it was actually linked to Beth's website, but about how to communicate with people when they're experiencing something traumatic. And it was saying we often default into something that feels like empathy, which is to say, I know what you're going through, or I have experienced some, when in fact you don't. Like I don't, if your father were to die, I don't know what it is to be Zeke Kelly experiencing the death of his father. It's actually much more helpful to say, I don't know what you're experiencing, but I care and I'm here for you. And if you need anything, please let me know. Can I do something practical for you? And again, it's about that action and that sense of activity. And instead, I think there's often this sense of, and it's like a natural human instinct, and it's to try and communicate something that is, I want to share this experience with you. Yeah. But there are just things we can't share with other people, and that's okay.
It's okay.
That's actually real. They know it, and it's and we know it, and we should be able to communicate at certain times. God, you know what? Your experience is different than mine, and is more intense than mine, and you are experiencing something I've never experienced, and I don't envy you it, but whatever I can do to let you know that I love you, like that's the thing to communicate. But it's sort of predicated upon, like, I'm not an expert, I don't know, I'm not having the same experience, and there is no perfect resolution here. And it's exactly what you're saying of, like, we have to acknowledge that, like, we can't control the universe, and we can't be perfect versions of the people we wish we could be.
Yeah. And it's, wow, it's crazy because, I play a lot of I used to play a whole lot of video games when I was younger. And the type of video games that I like were like RPG role-playing games where you can build a character. Yeah. And they're becoming insanely popular now where like you can fully immerse yourself in a second life and become a different person. Yeah. And the one thing that I have seen in those video games that is consistent, that whoever created those understands very, very clearly, is that there is no perfect character, right? There is, you have generically you might have someone who is more aggressive, or someone who is healing, or whatever the thing is. There are pros and cons, and it depends on the situation in which your strengths shine, right? But the idea is that if you create a proper group that has a balance, then you'll be ready for whatever situations that you might come up with. And as cheesy as that sounds, everyone is trying to be great at everything, and they're sacrificing a whole lot because you don't know that. It's like I was watching this movie Whiplash. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was about a drummer. It's like, the drummer movie. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's like, but it's as seemingly manic and evil. I can't remember the guy's name. The director, conductor of the group seems. As a musician, I get it. Like, it takes a level of intense sacrifice for you to reach a certain level of greatness that if that's what you want, if you're saying, I want to be as great as I possibly can, you have to sacrifice a lot. Yep. And sometimes it's not pretty. Sometimes it hurts physically. Sometimes it's not. It isolates you. Yeah, it isolates you. Yeah. It's not comfortable. Yep. In my opinion, no great musician, if you look at any of the greats, and if you ever see them talk about their lives, it is never, oh my God, my life was so. It's like, nope, I was completely isolated from everyone. I practiced 18 hours a day, this, that, and third. Some of them, I'm really happy I did it, but it comes at a cost, and people just don't. They want the thing, but they don't want the cost. And it brings my mind to the idea of locally sourcing foods, because people want the thing and don't want to think about the cost that goes into sourcing it, prepping it, the people that are involved in the system. And there is no, we don't actually pay the real cost for anything. We're subsidized by so many different people who are taking less money in the chain. I think, absolutely, with like locally grown foods. And then I think about this with books, just cost in general, cost as a way to assert a value you have in the world of what you want to support. And so with books, occasionally people will come to the Ivy and say, like, well, this is awfully expensive. Like, I could get this cheaper on Amazon. And honestly, it doesn't happen a lot, but it occasionally happens. And the answer that I have come up with is, oh, really? Like, I think $17 for that paperback is a really good deal for years of someone's time and effort. And if you say it that way, of like, the thing that's being valued here is this kind of extraordinary level of dedication and effort that went into this thing. And that's a totally appropriate value. And I'm not going to apologize for it. No. And if you don't want to buy it, and if you do want to devalue that act, then, and I don't say any of that back, but that's what's implicit there, then go ahead. Yeah.
And it's like when you frame it that way, when you say like, oh, I think that's an accurate valuation. That's a really good deal for the thing you're getting. It embarrasses people because it is an astonishingly good deal. And it's the same. It's like, do you know what went into producing that potato? Like, extraordinary effort went into producing that potato. And to the degree you want a cheap potato, you are creating systems that are toxifying our world. And that is reaping all sorts of catastrophic impact down the line that, you're then going to be like, well, why does it have to be this way? And it's like, well, it's because you wanted to save a quarter on that potato. And for people who truly don't have the quarter, okay. But for a lot of people, you do have that quarter and you're choosing not to spend it there on the things that matter most. And then you're incidentally spending it. And the differential between what people will pay passively for gasoline and what they will pay actively for like fresh locally sourced food and books. I'm like, but that's actually like destroying our world. And when the price fluctuates between $2.50 and $4, I mean, you notice and you complain about it, but you often don't stop driving. And the idea of cost to things should be actually, it costs a lot because it has a massive impact on things. And that's where, when I see plane tickets get really cheap, it's like I feel that tension. It's like I want to go, I want to go to Europe, but I know it should cost more than that for me to fly to Europe because it's not good for the world for me to fly to Europe a lot.
Yeah, exactly. If it were, it would have already been happening.
Right.
That is that weird thing about. No, it's really, really interesting because as you're talking, I'm just like, that's 100% true. There is this weird thing of capitalism or a capitalistic society like ours doesn't work if people are educated. And this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. Because if they are, people are standing in the Blockbuster or standing in the grocery store for a minute deciding, I actually don't like any of this.
Right.
But the idea is like, there's this curtain like in The Wizard of Oz where there's all these things that happen. Don't even worry about what's happening behind it.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor.
Just trust me. I got this. Here are your options.
Here's what you should want, and here are your options within that. And then like, take this. Exactly. And this price is appropriate.
Yeah.
And 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 the way that then the gatekeeping and status supported sort of with, or that a lot of those things are vested in. I think about it all the time in terms of like just brand and clothes and or brand in the world writ large, where it's like sometimes I really notice. Sometimes I think like that sweater, you can sort of tell the material of it is like from a sheep that was hand shorn in Iceland or something. But a lot of times it's just like somebody, it's a thing. It's a thing, and I don't really understand why that one is 1/4 the price of that one, and it's nothing more than marketing. But there's too much analysis one would have to put into it all the time to sort of discern and pick that stuff apart.
Yeah, it's a really diabolical way to circumvent a free market.
Yeah.
Well put.
To
just like completely sort of lull the people into a sense of like, don't worry about it. We got this. Here are your options here. And then like when you tell someone, all media is owned by 5 or 6 different corporations, just knowing that when you filter it down to everything that you experience, then you really realize that there is the illusion of choice, of true differentiation between Fox and MSNBC, when both of those things are just pandering to whatever emotions need to be pandered to just to get to the commercial break or to push whatever it is that they're pushing. And so you really have to silo yourself away from those things and just think about, what do I truly want? Wait, do I really eat this? Do I really enjoy this? Like,
is this good for me?
Is this good for me?
Come from somewhere?
Where does this come from? Like, exactly. Yeah. And it was, it was me going to places like Burr, like Parts and Labor, talking to different people because I had no little point of reference other than the fact that like my family's from South America and my grandmother would go to markets in the city. And there used to be a lot more to shop. Like she'd take me to like Caribbean market where they would literally get a family member from Jamaica or from Trinidad would bring back a bunch of stuff, and they would sell it. Was like coconut oil or shea butter, whatever it is, and it would usually be in a raw form. And I remember the first time I saw like a real banana, or like what an apple like that isn't domesticated looks like, or that isn't like super pumped up with it out. And I was like, wait, that's what an apple looks like, or that's what this looks like. And if you never have those experiences, and all you know is the apple or banana that you get at lunchtime, and that's your base, it's not really a free market.
No, and you don't know the flavor difference, and you don't know, and you start to think I mean, again, it really gets into a lot of connected. It's a great metaphor for a lot of the stuff we're talking about. The packaging looks great, and maybe the flavor is actually much less interesting. But also, if you're trained into thinking that tastes good, then when you get something else that looks a little odd with a much more intense flavor, it feels uncomfortable. And so, but it's like, well, it's natural, it's healthier, it's more flavorful, it's sort of everything about it is better in all kinds of ways, for you and for the grower and for society. And we haven't been told that that's true. And
well, as much as we could probably talk for another hour and a half, I think we've talked for
about an hour and a half.
About an hour and a half now. We definitely have to do a part 2 of this.
We should.
This was
great.
This
was really fun.
This was great. We'll do it again for sure.
We should.
And then we're thinking about how to do